Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are in week 3 in Intro to Social and Political Philosophy. Today we are talking about Rousseau, and for our next recorded lecture, we will be talking about John Rawls. Today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Next time, John Rawls. Both are called John, but one of them is French and one of them is Swiss and the other one's American. With that said, we're still talking about the social contract. Today, we're talking about different takes on the social contract, and we'll continue doing that with John Rawls as well. So, with that said, let's go ahead and continue. Don't forget what we learned last week regarding Hobbes and the social contract with Hobbes, because Rousseau and Rawls are going to be building on that same tradition. So, still on the same basic idea. Also, happy holidays for Halloween for anyone who visits. As you can see, my spouse kind of set up some like pumpkins over there and some other decorations over there. So, oh, and there's like a little devil dog over there. I'm not sure if you can see it. So yeah, happy Halloween, depending on when you see this, I suppose. But with that said, let me stop talking about my decorations and get on with this presentation. Okay, so for these slides, we're going to start by talking about Rousseau, a little bit of his biography, who he was. As we're going to see, what's going to be most important to his account is this idea of general will. It is notoriously difficult to understand, but we're going to go ahead and do our best. After that, we'll get into his book, The Social Contract. Obviously, you're not reading the whole book. The only whole book that you're reading in this course is the Charles Mills book, just because it would be impossible to read multiple books in such a short 9-week course. But we're going to read, he calls them book 1 and book 2, but really they're section 1 and section 2 of The Social Contract. That's where we're going to stop today. And for our next recorded lecture, we'll talk about John Rawls. Again, we'll start off with a little bit of autobiography, who he was. We'll talk about how he was inspired by social contract theory. And we'll talk about his book, A Theory of Justice. Obviously, again, you don't have to read the whole book. You can if you want to, if you're particularly inspired. But we're just going to be talking about chapter 1, sections 1 through 3. Do note that for your reading, you're supposed to read sections 1 through 4. But I found sections 1 through 3 to have sort of the bulk of what he wants to sort of tell us regarding his philosophy. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive on into Rousseau. Let's give a little bit of a bio on him. Let me shrink myself a little bit more right here. Who was this dude, right? Well, there's a picture of him right there. As I mentioned earlier, he was from Switzerland. I mistakenly said that he was from France earlier. That's because he spent so much time in Paris, and he also died in Paris. But he lived in the 1700s. He was also a novelist and a composer of operas. So he didn't only write political philosophy. Keep that in mind. His personal life was rather infamous as well, because he abandoned his children. And then later on, when he became a theorist of education and child rearing, so a philosopher of education, saying, oh, you should teach your children these things as opposed to that way. You should bring up your children this way as opposed to that way. That's kind of one of the things he became famous for in his lifetime. But when people figured out that he abandoned his children, his opponents definitely used that to criticize him. As I mentioned earlier, he did settle in Paris for much of his later life, and he was responsible for popularizing Romanticism in fiction. Romanticism in fiction usually has an emphasis in individualism, emotion, the glorification of the past, such as medieval times, princesses and princes and fighting the bad guys, as well as a glorification of nature as well. So he was the one who sort of popularized that in Europe, or at least in France at that time. And finally, what's most important for us in this course is that he continued with the same idea that Hobbes had regarding the social contract. He also was interested in figuring out if there is a legitimate government and what the limits to that government should be. And his answer was that people naturally come together and agree to give up some of their power. As we're going to see, though, there's going to be some variations between his account and Hobbes' account. So general will, the idea general will, it's a technical term. It's very important, and it's really important to figure out what it is and how do we identify it. I see some of my text got cut off there. What is it? How do we identify it? He believes the government, any government, should be run by the general will. Unfortunately, as I just mentioned, it is not at all clear what he means by it or how we can identify it or recognize it. And philosophers today, philosophers of history, philosophers of Rousseau, have struggled a lot. Here are some things that he might mean. I think he might mean the third one, but if you have a different interpretation, know that that is fine, as long as you can back it up, right? So he might mean that it's a type of compromise opinion that results from extreme views canceling each other out. So today in the United States, we have maybe, you can call them maybe the radical left or the radical right. Rousseau might say that those cancel each other out, and everyone that's left or right or central left or central right or just center would eventually compromise on an opinion, ignoring sort of the radical left and ignoring the radical right. And that would be the general will. Or he might mean something else entirely in some of his other readings. He might mean by general, that's something that's unknown to everyone, but a political genius. And this is something he talks about in his other books. The political genius is called the lawmaker. So no one can know it except for this political genius. Or thirdly, and I think this is what he means personally when I read and interpret him. I think by general will, what he means is that what each person in the community would want or would will if they were ideally selfless and ideally informed. So if they were not selfish, ideally unselfish, and ideally educated, this is what they would want. Unfortunately, as we will see, not everyone is ideally selfless and not everyone is ideally well educated. So keep this idea of general will in mind, because it's going to cause some problems for us by the time we finish talking about Rousseau. So book one, what is he telling us in book one? Well, he tells us very plainly, Rousseau, that the purpose is to consider if in political society there can be any legitimate and sure principle of government. This should sound very familiar. He's basically saying, should we have to listen to government? And his answer, spoiler alert, is going to be that through the social contract, through people coming together and agreeing to give up some of their power, the government is legitimate and we have to listen to them. So in the first chapter in book one, he goes through a lot of different themes and ideas. He's a little less methodical than Hobbes, but I can sort of give you sort of the big pieces of his train of thought. He starts off by considering first societies. And he says this, the only natural society is that of the individual family. And he's thinking very heteronormatively here with a father, mother, and children. He says, but even this has limitations because he says, once the children are freed from the obedience they owe their father, and the father is freed from his responsibility towards them, both parties equally regain their independence. So two things. Read into this whatever you want, the fact that he did abandon his children. And secondly, he's basically saying here that these societies do not last, because once the child is no longer needing the parents to protect them, they no longer owe obedience to them. And once the parent is giving them all the tools necessary to survive on their own, the parent doesn't owe them anything. This society does not last. The only natural society, being the family, does not last. He also starts talking about slaves here, and at this point he does mean slaves as the way me and you would understand slaves. He says slaves, natural or otherwise, because he does have some very unsavory, very bad and rather racist views that some people are natural slaves, which goes back to Greek philosophy. He says slaves and the master, although they may benefit the master, do not compromise a society. It's simply one individual and one individual's will. There's no agreement or anything. That's not a society, to have just one master and a bunch of slaves. Not society. And he says, well, maybe might makes right, right? Maybe the most powerful person or the most powerful agency in that group of people, in that community, becomes the government, and they force everyone to become a society with them. And he says, he asks us, does this make a society? And he says, no, this is nonsense. This does not make a society, because in society we have ideas of obligation and duty and right and wrong. We have that in our society. We have that in most society. We have ideas of what's morally right and morally wrong. You can be a cultural relativist, not a cultural relativist, but you will be hard pressed to say that our society does not have ideas of right and wrong. But if society was just determined by might making right, the most powerful decides what's right, he says that's nonsense. You cannot ever contradict that, because the most strong will always be right, right? Um, Suppose you have the most powerful person in the room. Well, if they're defeated, they we're not violating the rule might mix, right? If they're beat up, we're not violating the rule might mix, right? Because they actually weren't the strongest person anymore. The person who beat them up is the strongest person. So the rule can never be violated might mix, right? Because the strongest person will always be on top. And if they're not on top, we were wrong to think that they were the strongest person. So might makes right tells us nothing, it's useless. Or secondly, it doesn't tell us anything moral, because why should we listen to the strongest person? There's no moral duty to listen to the strongest person. Our only concern is to become stronger. You do not get out of society with might makes right, and you do not get at morality with might makes right. So how do we get a society? Not through families and not through might makes right. What else can we consider? Well, what if we just enslave a bunch of people again? Which kind of goes back to what we said earlier, right? And at this point, note that he is using the term broadly, different from how we would use it. He's including what we would consider slaves to begin with, obviously, but he's also considering just political constituents that do not have freedom to do everything in the society. He's also considering people like me and you that have a government that we should be prima facie, at face value, loyal to and obedient to. By a slave, he just means someone that gives themselves or sells themselves. Obviously, if you sell yourself, you're a slave the way me and you would understand it today. But if you just sort of give yourself, what he means by that is that you give yourself conditionally to obey a government. So he means me and you, right? Including actual slaves that we will consider today. And he says this: it is very unlikely a whole society would give themselves to a government or to one group of people. It is impossible, however, that they could convince the next generation to continue obeying the government. So a government built on slavery does not make a society, because again, it will not last. You would have to get everyone to say, yes, I give myself to the government, I promise to obey them. And you will need everyone in the next generation to also do the same. Impossible. The only way to make a society is through what he calls the original covenant, through the social contract. This should sound very familiar, because he's basically just channeling Hobbes and Locke here. He says, how do we make a society? Well, a people can give themselves to a ruler. But how do we make a people? Well, we have to figure out how to make a people, so then the people can give themselves to a ruler, and then that's the society. How do we make sure the people is a people as opposed to just an assortment of persons, right? He says, a people is made through the original covenant. The only way people can preserve themselves is by uniting their separate powers. The articles of association are reducible to a single one, namely the total alienation, you give yourself entirely to obey, by each associate of himself and all his rights to the whole community. This then creates the sovereign or the government. The sovereign is formed entirely of the individuals who compose it. It has not, nor could it have, any interest contrary to theirs. So he's saying something very interesting there. He's saying that the government, since it's made up of the individuals, cannot have a goal that goes against these people, ever. By logic, it's logically impossible for them to do so. And this is going to relate to his idea of general will. Again, I think I skipped something. This is going to relate to his idea of general will. The idea is that the sovereign is guided by the general will, which promotes the well-being of the whole society. But if the government is doing something else that doesn't benefit all society, well, guess what? It's not being guided by the general will, because the general will, by definition, promotes society. What's happening there is that someone in the government is being guided not by the general will, but by their own private will and their own selfish desires. Again, the general will, by definition, always promotes society. Let's talk a little bit more about this general will. He says that's inalienable and indivisible. If those terms sound familiar to you, it reminds you of the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance. That should not be surprising, because we were very inspired by Rousseau and some of his ideas when we made our country, the United States. He says power can be delegated, but you cannot relinquish, the government cannot relinquish its power. If the country is sold, it is done by someone's private will. The general will never sort of become a puppet state of its own accord. So you might be saying, Victor, you said earlier that general will, by definition, will always get it right. Do you really mean that? And yes, Rousseau actually means that. The general, by definition, will always do the right thing for the community. It will never err. It will never get anything wrong. Again, if it looks like someone in the government is doing something wrong, that is because they are not following the general will, they're following the private will. If the government does make a mistake, here are some troubleshooting tips according to Rousseau. Make the community smaller, because if you make the community smaller, it's easier to get at the general will, it's easier to inform everyone, and it's easier to make sure that no one follows their private will. He says, interestingly, have no political parties or have many. Sorry, I think I miswrote that. Have no political parties or have many political parties in order to make sure that people are not being brainwashed. And finally, just educate everyone. If you do these things, then you can get at the general will, hopefully, Rousseau thinks. Here are some takeaway questions from Rousseau, right? To begin, what is the general will? I told you what I think it believes, but you having read this, what is your take on it? And finally, is the general will attainable? He says that we have to make sure everyone's educated, that there's not political parties, but if there is political parties, that we have a lot, that we don't have, for instance, a two-party system, and that the community is rather small. Is the general will even attainable? He thinks it is, and he thinks that once we follow the general will, everything will be great. But if we can ever get it, will it ever actually be great? Will society ever be great if we cannot identify and attain the general will? I'll leave that for you to answer. Be very interested to hear your discussion post. Okay, until next time, we'll talk about Rawls. Take it easy, folks.